A very good afternoon and welcome to GB News Live.
Labour has accused Home Secretary Suella Braverman of encouraging extremists on all sides and attacking the police when she should be backing them.
The Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, was granted an urgent question in the Commons on the operational independence of the Metropolitan Police.
Policing Minister Chris Philps said the pro-Palestinian protests, attended by tens of thousands of protesters in recent weeks, have largely passed without significant incident.
She is deliberately inflaming community tensions. Remembrance events are really important to all of us. Those events need to be protected. That is the job of the police, to enforce, to respect the law, maintaining public safety, tackling hate crime and extremism, and respecting rights in law to peaceful protest. And they have to follow the law and the evidence, whatever politicians think, not be the operational arm of the Home Secretary.
I don't think it's acceptable that our fellow citizens feel scared or uneasy walking about the streets of London. And it is reasonable for politicians, the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and others, I'm sure some on the other side of the House as well, to raise those concerns and make sure that the police are protecting those communities. Members of our own community are feeling scared this weekend. Let's keep that at the front of our mind, not party political point scoring.
Well, this all comes ahead of pro-Palestinian groups planning to march on Armistice Day and appeared to be set to go ahead despite government objections.
Let's discuss this further now with GB News' Senior Political Commentator Nigel Nelson. Hello to you, Nigel. Good afternoon. What do you think Suella Braverman's game plan here is? Is she on a mission to get herself sacked?
Well, I think she's on a mission to become the next leader of the Tory party, and that's the reason for doing what she's doing. The question about whether or not she should be sacked is obviously down to Rishi Sunak, and that causes a problem. When Rishi Sunak loses the next election, he will obviously have to quit. Suella Braverman was almost sure to run for the leadership after that. The danger of sacking her, of course, is that she might mount a challenge before the next election. So for Rishi Sunak, it's a very decision what he does about her.
Nigel, it is interesting. We've been hearing this morning from allies of the Home Secretary that the contentious article that appeared in the Times that she wrote was sent to Number 10, was sent back. But in the last few minutes, we've had word from the official spokesperson of the Prime Minister that, quote, the article was not cleared with Number 10. That's coming from the Prime Minister's official spokesperson in the last few minutes. And we're hearing that there'll be a further update from Number 10 later on today. This is an enormous rift now between the Prime Minister and his Home Secretary.
Yes, what it seems to have happened is that the article was sent to Number 10 for approval. Number 10 came back with a number of amendments to it, quite rightly so. I mean, some of them is absolutely appalling, especially when she talked about a comparison with Northern Ireland. It seems like that Suella Braverman decided not to make those amendments. That, of course, is a sacking offence, so it rather depends on how strong Rishi Sunak feels about whether he goes through with it and gets rid of her. And as I've just said, he's got to bear in mind that if she's on the back benches, she could be even more wild.
Talking about backbenchers, can we read anything into the fact that there's only been a couple of Tory backbenchers who have defended her in the Commons over this incendiary article?
Yes, the majority of reasonable Tory MPs, and in fairness to them, most of them are reasonable, are absolutely appalled by the language that Suella Braverman has been using. She repeats again in her Times article that these are hate marches. The idea of comparing it with Northern Ireland is just ridiculous and dangerous. What was happening in Northern Ireland was a civil war on UK streets, and marches there had the potential of causing shootings and bombings, and that's why some of those were banned. We're nowhere near that here. It also is undermining Sir Mark Rowley's ability to police this demonstration when he's getting unhelpful noises off from his own boss, the Home Secretary.
Nigel, these are extraordinary developments we're seeing this morning. Your interpretation is that this update further that we might hear today from the Prime Minister's spokesman, from number 10, could be an update on the future of the Home Secretary. Are we really sitting here thinking that the Home Secretary could lose her job today? Is it that serious?
Yes, it is that serious. And I think that the word very much was actually could lose her job. Whether Rishi Sunak will go that far, we'll have to see. But if you've got a cabinet minister who accepts collective responsibility, putting an article through number 10 as they are required to do, and then not making the amendments that number 10 asks for, that is a sacking offence.
What about, Nigel, the timing of this, though, if indeed he does sack her? Because we now know that next Wednesday the Supreme Court will rule on government's Rwanda policy. So this would be quite dodgy timing, wouldn't it, for Suella Braverman to go?
It would be, but it's timing of Suella Braverman's choice. She must know that interventions like this are not only unhelpful, but actually stoke up and inflame what is going on at the weekend. So she has chosen to do that. I think it does come down to very much about just how strong the Prime Minister feels in his position, whether he takes action against her.
Just finally, Nigel, isn't it the case that Suella Braverman speaks for a huge proportion of the Conservative coalition, a huge proportion of voters that, frankly, the Prime Minister cannot afford to lose? These are people that he needs to be winning back, not losing, if he's within any hope of winning the next election. Frankly, didn't the Home Secretary's article reflect a lot of that opinion? The feeling in much of the country that the police take sides on these protests and behave very differently towards far-right marches than they do towards Islamist marches, for example.
Well, no, I think that's actually complete nonsense, what she's saying there. That what the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Mark Rowley, is saying is, look, Parliament make the law. The police are there to police them, quite rightly. And this march on Saturday has not met the threshold of causing the kind of disorder that would require it to be banned. Now, I think most people would actually accept the police should be operationally independent. They're not a political arm of the Home Office. And so when Suella Braverman comes out with comments like this, the people will recognise that she is stoking up problems rather than calming them down.
OK, GB News' senior political commentator Nigel Nelson, thanks very much for your analysis on that. Well, let's talk to legal commentator Joshua Rosenberg, who can join us now. Good afternoon to you. Is Suella Braverman stoking up division here with this article?
Well, look at what she said. I think this is the key paragraph. She says, "I do not believe that these marches are merely a cry for help for Gaza. They are an assertion of primacy by certain groups, particularly Islamists, of the kind we are more used to seeing in Northern Ireland. Also disturbingly reminiscent of Ulster are the reports that some of Saturday's March group organisers have links to terrorist groups, including Hamas." Now, she talks about Islamists, she talks about links to terrorist groups. She obviously has evidence for that. It's the comparison with Northern Ireland, which has clearly concerned a lot of people. Nobody's said that before. Yes, she is obviously skating on very thin ice, as your political commentator has said.
It is extraordinary that we are sitting here in the position whereby we're talking now seriously about the Prime Minister perhaps about to fire someone who holds one of the great offices of state. Is it really that level of consequence for an article like this?
Well, it can be, because, as your commentator Nigel has explained, it's all about collective responsibility. If you are in the cabinet, you must follow the party line, literally. And if you are choosing to go off on what lawyers call a frolic of your own, if you are simply taking your own path down this very sensitive area, of course you're going to upset the Prime Minister. And as we've seen, as you've heard, Rishi Sunak, has got to decide whether to assert his authority. I mean, there's always somebody who can serve as Home Secretary. Suella Braverman resigned as Attorney General previously. She resigned certainly for a while, and she was reinstated in the government after a few days.
Well, wasn't the point, though, there, that her reinstatement, which took a lot of Westminster by surprise, was because Rishi Sunak felt like he needed allies on the right of the party. He'd lost to Liz Truss, he became Prime Minister without an election. He needs the support of people like Suella Braverman, otherwise he loses a huge chunk of his coalition.
That's perfectly true, but equally he presumably doesn't particularly want somebody who refers quite specifically to Islamists and groups that have links to terrorist groups. He's going to upset a considerable number of people in this country if he allows her to say that. So he's got to balance these politically.
Is not partly the job of the Home Secretary to calm everything down? She knows exactly what has been going on this week in terms of the debate surrounding this Armistice Day protest, or peace march, as some people are calling it. And all she's done is potentially inflame these tensions and made it a heck of a lot more difficult for the police.
I think that's perfectly fair. I mean, the crucial point about her Times article is she accepts the position that the Met Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, is in that it is his decision. And she says at the beginning, we pride ourselves on our long-established traditions of freedom of expression. The right to protest is a cornerstone of democracy. Only in the most exceptional circumstances do the authorities step in. So in that sense, she is saying exactly what the Police Commissioner said. He says we haven't got to the exceptional circumstances which justify him stepping in.
I mean, she just seems to, when you look at the article, she seems to generalise. She talks about poppy sellers being mobbed. Well, we saw poppy sellers surrounded by protesters, but we don't actually know whether those poppy sellers were forced to walk away or felt intimidated.
They looked quite uncomfortable.
When you look at the photo, they were not being mobbed, and there's been poppy sellers today that are saying we are still going to go to train stations, we are still going to sell poppies. They're not intimidated enough to stay away from it.
I think Suella Braverman is right to refer to a great deal of unease, and it goes much further than that, among many people, particularly the Jewish community, but many others as well, at the sort of things that have been said in this march. And one of the things that she says very clearly is the police have got to deal with disorder, they've got to make arrests, they've got to deal with people who break the law. And nobody would deny that. Exactly how they do it, whether they pull people out of a crowd, whether they take pictures of people and then summon them later, is obviously an operational matter for the police. She's right to say that the police must do their job, and she isn't actually saying in this piece that they were wrong when they said that they were not going to ban the procession, which is due to take place on Saturday.
Just finally, she does also make a comparison in this article between the way that the police attend some protests versus others. She particularly points out the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer of 2020 that occurred during lockdown, and people were not arrested simply for gathering then, whereas other gatherings, of course, people were arrested. Do you think there's legitimacy in this idea of a two-tier justice system?
I've heard a lot of people assert that. I've never heard a Home Secretary assert that. And your broad point that she perhaps shouldn't be taking sides on these matters is, I think, a very fair one. Some people think that what's happened is very disturbing and damaging and intimidating and frightening. Some people think that the police are treating people differently. The police would say, we're simply trying to keep the warring sides apart, we're allowing people to let off steam, we're trying to make sure that it doesn't clash with other matters, we're keeping them away from the cenotaph, we're keeping the timing different. That's how the police normally operate, and you're absolutely right to say it doesn't make it any easier when the Home Secretary intervenes in this way.
I think a former Met Assistant Commissioner has said that ministers are now on the verge of behaving unconstitutionally. Are we at that point now?
Well, the Constitution is very flexible. That's the great thing about the British Constitution. You make it up as you go along. I think that a lot of people are surprised that somebody in her position, as you say, Home Secretary, great office of state, behaves in this way. Slightly more worrying when she said things like this when she was Attorney General. She is entitled to say what she thinks, but the Prime Minister is entitled to say that's not government policy, and perhaps out you go.
Well,
Joshua,
There we go.
really appreciate your contribution to this discussion. Thank you for coming in.
Not at all.
Potentially a belligerent Home Secretary, but not as belligerent as Winston Churchill when he was Home Secretary and attended one of these protests, goading on the police to attack the protesters in the 1920s. I don't think we're quite at that point yet.